First of all, I wanted to thank you for joining us today on this session. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Rachel Lee, and I'm the Library Relations Manager for the press. And we put together this webinar as a response to the many questions that we've had about the impact factor, what it means for your journal, what other metrics are out there, and how you can use the impact, how you can help your journal increase its impact factor. So I wanted to introduce the people that will be presenting today. First of all, we have Judy Luther from Informed Strategies. Judy developed Informed Strategies in 1997 to bring a customer-oriented perspective to the design and development of electronic products. Her experience includes 12 years managing sales at the Institute for Scientific Information, preceded by 13 years managing academic libraries. She's a frequent industry speaker and is a past president for the Society of Scholarly Publishing, and has served on the boards of the North American Serials Interest Group and the Association for Information and Dissemination Centers. Joining her is October Ivins. October is also part of Informed Strategies, and she specializes in collaborative projects that help libraries, information producers and vendors analyze environmental changes and develop opportunities. She specialized in serials acquisitions and user support as an academic librarian, and she has a fascination with the challenges of scholarly publishing, which led to her first professional activities to identify common ground for publishers, librarians, and vendors. And then later she worked on a self-designed doctoral program on information products in digital libraries. She's a frequent speaker at industry meetings, addressing the role of small publishers in the scholarly communication ecosystem. We'll also have input from Tim Beardsley, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Bioscience, the preeminent publication of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, a position he has held since 2002. Tim has a doctorate in animal behavior from Oxford University, worked for 3 years on the editorial staff of Nature in London and Washington, followed by 13 years on the editorial staff of Scientific American. And before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. All your lines will be muted, so if you have any questions, please use the chat, and I will field these questions to the presenters, and we'll have a Q&A towards the end. This session is also being recorded, and we'll host it online and let you know where you can access this after the webinar is finished. So now I've finished with that, I'll hand over to October and Judy.
Thanks, Rachel. Welcome, everybody. We have really enjoyed working on this and putting it together for you. I just want to acknowledge a few of the other people, in addition to Rachel, from the University of California Press who have helped us. These are Rebecca Darksmith, Jeff Hester, Devin Weston, and Gabe Alvaro. Thank you all very much. Today we've divided up the topics by speaker, although we'll be trading off a little bit. I'm going to start out covering why you should care about this topic. Judy's going to go into more detail about what the different metrics are. We're not just doing the impact factor, but some additional metrics. And then Tim, who can speak with much more authority than either of us, is going to talk about what editors and authors can do to improve their metrics. And then Judy will conclude with what publishers can do. Then we'll be ready for an open discussion with your questions. If you do have any questions as we go through, please note the slide number. And if there's anything that is just unclear and shouldn't wait until the end, please use your chat and Rachel will let us know. Thank you. Okay, why should you care? Well, you should care because authors care. For many of your authors, and probably for you yourself before you became an editor, publishing in a journal with an impact factor, or especially a high impact factor, may be one of the things that's considered when you're up for promotion and tenure. Even if you're sort of beyond or not directly in a tenure situation, publishing in high impact factor journals are more visible and connotes prestige. When you apply for grants, grant reviewers, formally or informally, may be considering the impact factor of where you've published before and where you plan to distribute your results. All things being equal, this means that authors are going to choose to submit their manuscript to the journal with the highest impact factor. There is growing evidence that in some countries in the developing world, faculty members are actually paid. They receive financial recognition for high impact factor journals. I think Judy told me the story is that in China, people can get $100,000 if they get an article into Science or Nature. So maybe we should all move. Why publishers care? Well, publishers care because an impact factor has a direct impact on the quality and quantity of the submissions to a journal. It is used as an indicator of quality in promoting a journal. So even if you're not especially interested, your cohort journals, the other journals where your authors may be considering publishing, are going to be using the impact factor to promote their title. There is a journal rank, which is based on the impact factor itself, that shows the relative importance within the assigned discipline for your title. And generally, titles with impact factors they're in a subset. It's not all peer-reviewed titles in a particular discipline, but the ones that Thomson, using its own metrics, has determined are the best. And simply being included usually indicates you have a global audience. So for a combination of all of these factors, the bottom line is that publishers think they're going to sell better than those without it. So they take it very seriously. Librarians care. I think library subscriptions may be running about 30 to 50% of journal revenue for most academic journals. And the way librarians have conducted journal reviews, which is kind of our code for journal cancellation studies, is they use a lot of different factors, but they do use citation studies. You may think that usage is the main thing driving renewals, and usage is important, but usage really looks at readers. Citation studies look at authors, look at faculty members and graduate students. And librarians are very interested in serving this primary clientele on their campus. So it's important for them to understand the journals where their faculty and graduate students are publishing, and also the journals that they cite. They want to make sure they're meeting their needs. Cost per use is not directly related to the impact factor. It may tie into some of the other metrics we'll be looking at, but that is a more general figure, not something to be discounted, but it is disproportionately weighted by undergraduate use. And undergraduates are not very discriminating. They will kind of use what's easy to find. So another thing that happens in libraries, these journal cancellation projects, I've worked on many of them, and what we do is come up with a long list of titles that are currently subscribed to, perhaps showing price, perhaps not, perhaps showing publisher, perhaps not, distributing those lists to the faculty and asking them to rank them or show their cutoff point or say what's essential, what's nice to have. And then that feedback from the faculty is considered very seriously in deciding what to retain. So, the universe that affects scholarly publishing continues to change and is probably changing more rapidly than ever. I could have used the same slide 10 years ago, but it's still true. More journals are being published every year. The impact of Google and other general search tools But in particular, these new, very sophisticated, very powerful library discovery tools are finding content that meets users' search criteria that the libraries can't afford to provide. About this time last year, I heard a talk by Dan Hazen at Harvard, who was talking, bemoaning the fact that these new discovery tools make it impossible for Harvard to supply all of the subscription content that their users want. So you can imagine what that's like for a library that's smaller than Harvard. Library budgets go through cycles like anybody else. And since the current recession that started in 2008, a library that just has a flat budget considers itself lucky. There are libraries that have cuts. There are more that have cuts than have increases, and the majority have flat budgets. Well, these flat budgets actually represent a declining budget, a shrinking budget, because journal costs are not static. They continue to increase every year. So this is just one example of, I was talking about how libraries use metrics in making their renewal decisions. This is a slide that was taken from a California Digital Library presentation at a national conference. 2 librarians, 2 other electronic resources managers, collection development managers, the people who make the purchasing decisions in libraries. The California Digital Library, as you probably know, is part of the University of California System Office of the President, and it conducts license negotiation on behalf of the 10 UC campuses. So they have a lot of clout, and people take what they say very seriously. So they were explaining that they look at 3 different metrics in making their renewal decisions. They take 2 that address quality, the impact factor, which comes from Thomson, and then a newer measure you may not be too familiar with, the SNP from Elsevier, which is the, Judy help me, the standard
source normalized impact per paper. We'll be explaining that in greater detail in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks, Judy. And then utility. Okay, so utility is, can you get to it? How easy is it to download? Does it work? So that's the reader measure. And then the faculty measure, journals that they cite. So they're going to all of this work to be able to make comparisons. They also look at cost effectiveness, where they don't just take a cost per use, but a cost per SNP. Okay. So this is a way of sort of normalizing the different kind of metrics that they use and seeing what it actually costs. So what they're going to say is, if we get so few uses that we don't really need a subscription, we'll just go to pay-per-view. Okay, so that includes kind of a quick tour of why you should care, and now Judy's going to describe the metrics in more detail for you.
Thank you, October. In looking at preparing for this discussion today, we thought that it might be useful to position the metrics we're going to discuss in the broader landscape in terms of what we're covering as well as what we're not covering. And there are a number of new measures in the field. Impact factor has been the longest and best established, but the H-index has emerged primarily as a measure for authors. You will see it in Scopus, the Elsevier database. That's a giant index. And when it appears there, it's actually indicating the number of articles in a journal. It will appear underneath next to each journal title and give you a metric, but that's really indicating just the number of articles that have in that journal that have received, whose authors have received an H-index measure. And that can be compared to the total number of articles in the journal, but that we're really not focusing so much on authors as individuals because that's also new and emerging. under articles, and many people would like to know the metric for the articles. The article influence is a metric created by the eigenfactor, which you see in the next column over. Eigenfactor is focused on the journal. Article influence is focused on the article. Once again, we're not going to spend any time talking about that. Our focus today is going to be entirely on journals, the well-established impact factor, the newer eigenfactor, and the ones that have just been introduced, whose acronyms are SJR and SNP. It'd be useful at this point for us to get a sense from you as to how familiar you are and what your level of experience has been with Thompson's impact factor. So perhaps you could enter your results here and let us see what your, how many of you are familiar with it. All right, very good. Strong showing here. Everybody's heard of it, and some of you have actually used it. So I'm going to ask about the newer metrics. If you can take a look at that as well and give me a quick response in terms of your familiarity with Elsevier's SJR and SNP. And this would be familiarity with either or one or the other of those. All right, and skipping to the results, what you might expect with a newer measure. Some of you have heard of it, and the rest of us are not as familiar with it. So let's begin. In this landscape, the metrics that are used and are being introduced really are derived from two different databases. Thomson Reuters, and Thomson a number of years ago bought the Institute for Scientific Information, where I had worked for a few years, and they subsequently introduced what was then known as the citation indexes, and the web came along and they were introduced as the Web of Science and more broadly as the Web of Knowledge, depending on the scope of the content covered. Thomson started this, or Eugene Garfield started this company in the 1960s. Its coverage goes back to the 1900s, and its focus is limited. The 12,000 journals is a relatively new and higher number. For a number of years, a decade ago, it had closer to 8,000 titles, and it was really focused on the ones that they felt had impact. And in working with the database, they were able to extract a certain amount of data and develop a calculation that we'll be looking at in a minute called the impact factor. They also have been promoting and supporting the eigenfactor, which is a variation on the impact factor. Elsevier is a major competitor to Thomson. They both produce a lot of academic content, and Elsevier decided to introduce their own index, which they have called Scopus. This started only 5 years ago. It was launched in 2006. Their coverage is back to about the time content was available in digital form in 1996. But their intent was to cover a broader range of titles, those that may not have hit the register in terms of perhaps being considered for inclusion in Thomson's database, but which were of a high caliber and met criteria for peer-reviewed, regularly published content that was available in a digital form. From this database, they have derived two measures, the SJR, which is called the SCImago Journal Rank, and the SNP, which we'll be going into, the Source Normalized Impact per Paper. Our objective here is not to focus on the details so much as to give you a sense of these measures and give you a chance to determine which ones might be important to you and why they might matter to you. So the Thomson impact factor is, as we said before, journal metric, and its core measure here, taking the number of cites in a journal and the citation window, as they call it, the amount of time period covered will vary. It will be from citations made to article in a journal in the current year for content that was published either 2 years prior or 5 years prior. And then the denominator here is the number of articles total that are published in that journal in that time frame. So you're really getting an average cite per journal. And that is considered the indicator, and is the metric that you will see appear in a number of these other subsequent measures with variations on a theme. But I wanted to highlight this because it's the core metric here. Factors that influence this impact factor are such things as review articles, which are highly cited, and if you have a review article in your journal, it's likely to increase the impact factor. Some people have attempted to game the system by including citing themselves quite regularly. Thomson became wise to that, and back in 2003 did a study on it, and then subsequently implemented an ongoing measure where the self-citations aren't to individuals, they're to the journal itself. So as an author in a journal, if you cite a prior article in a journal, there are many times where that would be appropriate. One would expect it to occur. But once it goes past a certain level of citations, a certain volume of them, then Thomson will start to measure them, and occasionally they will exclude a journal for a year or two, kind of send them out for a cooling off period if they have been abusing or going well beyond what would be considered the norm. So that's a good thing to know, that they're measured. The number of articles can make a difference, volume counts, and the number of years that are covered will, as you see up above, 2 years or 5 years, can also influence the impact factor. As you might expect, the longer the time period, the more likely you are to accumulate citations to the content. Now, the citation patterns will vary, and quite dramatically, by discipline. Biology and the life sciences tend to be highly cited. It's not unusual to see impact factors of 15, highs of 30s and 40s, compared to some disciplines that move more slowly, such as math. Math citation window for math doesn't even occur within the first 2 years, according to many mathematicians. So while life sciences may be citing each other before the journal is formally released once it's accepted, mathematicians have a much longer timeline. And certainly the volume of citations, again in the life sciences, it's not unusual to see a long list of references, and that's not necessarily true for many of the social sciences, and even in engineering. So those differences, given that this one metric is the same across all disciplines, the same in terms of the same manner of calculation, it doesn't necessarily take into consideration these variations in patterns. And that's reflected in this next slide, which October will speak to.
Thanks, Judy. Yeah, in this slide, we wanted to demonstrate a couple of things for you. One is that while it's typical for a journal to be in only 1 or 2 categories, they can be in up to 7. So this is an example of 12 similar titles that are in 7 different categories. So the point I want to make here is that it's very difficult to compare impact factors to a title that is not in your category. And there are also some problems with the categories themselves. The category may not be a good representation of your cohort, of the titles you consider your peer or aspirational peer titles. So in this instance, just by way of illustration, animal behavior probably started out in zoology, where it was really highly rated, 5 out of 145. That's a pretty good-sized group. And then at some point, Thomson spun off behavioral sciences, where the relative rank drops. This is down at about maybe 25%. But of course, in behavioral science, human behavior probably predominates rather than animal. Okay, here's another example. Conservation biology, probably started in ecology. And it's now also listed in the newer discipline of environmental sciences and in biodiversity sciences. And then the Journal of Wildlife Management is probably another one that started out over here in zoology, and now it's in ecology, where its ranking, its position within the number of titles here is relatively lower. It's lower than 50% because ecology, of course, is much broader than wildlife, whereas wildlife, since it's all about animals, is going to be relatively higher in zoology. So, you don't have to take a lot away from this. I just want to make the point that these categories that Thomson comes up with are somewhat artificial. They've responded to criticisms by creating more of them. But the thing is, you're still essentially being compared to a closed universe. We've also talked about how the Thomson titles, there are fewer of them than there are in some of the other metrics. Okay. Judy, do you have any more comments on this one?
Well, thanks, October. There is, in terms of your rank in a discipline, it's interesting to see if you're either in the top half and whether or not your title may fall into the bottom quadrant. Thomson tends to look at titles in quadrants. So if you're in the bottom quadrant in that particular category, it either may not be such a good fit, or it may be that you want to take a look at doing some things to raise it, and we'll be speaking to that later. So Thomson has some challenges for the impact factor in that it doesn't really adapt to the different disciplines. It may be relevant within a category, but it doesn't work across the disciplines within the academy. And sometimes even the sub-disciplines are variable enough. For instance, bioinformatics is a very popular topic right now, has a higher impact factor than its cohort of journals in probability and statistics. So you can see where those variations could well influence what happens to the rest of the titles in a category. And the impact factors will vary, as we've noted here, based on the citation behavior, as it's called, within disciplines, whether they're rapid citations and high levels of them and large volumes of publications. True for the life sciences, not so true for the social sciences. Because the impact factor has been the only measure available, people have relied on it and used it in ways that it was never intended to be used. Remember that the impact factor is a representative of the average of articles in a journal, and in some cases, faculty up for promotion and tenure have been measured based on that average, which may or may not be valid for their particular article in the journal. There are also concerns about promotion and tenure committees and committees that are not familiar with another discipline, and the raw numbers in no way take into consideration the importance of what goes in disciplines or goes on in disciplines where the impact factor is considerably lower than it might be for a hard science discipline. So the impact factor tends to favor fields that map to a certain behavior, and that makes it problematic for many of the titles that don't fare as well with as high a number. The eigenfactor is a much more recent measure, and that was designed basically on the premise of the Google PageRank. And the premise here is that citations from journals really should be counted and weighted differently based on how important that journal is. The level of influence it has probably derived from the impact factor as a measure of influence. Now, the eigenfactor uses a network approach to analyzing the importance of these publications based on how often they cite each other. And they're included, this number, eigenfactor number, is included in Thomson's publications, the journal citation reports. It can be found in the data they distribute. The nice thing about the eigenfactor is it's really good with emerging categories. Thomson is the only one that has predetermined categories, which probably was suitable back when they started in the 1960s. But in this day and age, with a number of interdisciplinary topics and the exciting amount of research that's being done in new and developing fields, having a measure that actually puts a journal in with its cohort, and that cohort could change from year to year, has some advantages. The drawbacks to the eigenfactor is that it's derived from Thomson's impact factor, and therefore it's limited to the number of titles that are in the Thomson database. Also, the size of the journals will affect the eigenfactor score. It tends to weight more heavily those journals that are more highly cited. So if anything, it puts a spotlight on a tendency in the system to advantage the journals that have a rapid citation and a large volume of citations. If you go to the eigenfactor page, you'll find a sample of a map here, and they have some really interesting graphics and visuals that depict and reflect how they are doing their analysis. This is two faculty members at the University of Washington who've developed the eigenfactor. So the eigenfactor is a prestige modification to the impact factor. Elsevier, after they developed the Scopus database, have in the last 2 years released these two new measures. I believe they supported the development of them. And they were done at different locations. The Scimago journal rank is more comparable to the eigenfactor. It has a similar metric in that it develops its own impact value or impact factor, and it weights on prestige. And that prestige is based on the impact factor calculated within the Scopus database, which remember is a larger database than the Thomson database. And also, like the eigenfactor, the journal categories are fluid and they're self-organizing. They'll change from year to year. SNP came from a very different motivation. SNP basically was, it's called source normalized impact per paper, but its basic intent was to balance the difference in citation patterns across the disciplines and to give the social science titles whose numbers are low compared to the life sciences an opportunity to kind of balance provide balance in those metrics so that you would have a number that you could use as indeed a valid metric across all of the disciplines, and it would show influence. And they did that by taking the current citation measure, the same type of measure but done on their data, the number of sites divided by the number of potential articles or number of articles in that journal. And they put that measure in the numerator, and in the denominator they pulled in something that they have developed called the citation potential, which actually looks at the average number of references in the journals that are citing your journal. So you're not doing it across journals in a category. You're actually creating a metric that includes in the measure itself the potential for the possibility that you would be cited that your article in your journal would be cited. This also helps if you're in a field that's a niche field or one that's not particularly well covered in a database, because you'll be brought into a cohort of titles that are related to your title naturally. So again, if you cross disciplines and you pull from multiple disciplines, it's a self-organizing pattern here. And here is one of their visuals for how it's laid out. You can see how dominant medicine is here compared, but biochemistry isn't far behind, followed by engineering down here, and up at the top we have social sciences. So October has done a fair amount of analyses here and has some data to share with you that illustrate the features of these different metrics.
Thanks, Judy. I was trying to get my little green guy to work. Okay. Please don't take this data as gospel or the be-all and end-all. We tried to select representative examples, so think of these as representative rather than authoritative. The first thing I want to point out is that the 6 titles we're considering here come from 2 categories, biology and ecology. So we've already illustrated that they're not going to be directly comparable. Biology has 85 titles, and ecology has 129 in the group of titles that Thomson is comparing. So what I have done, the next slide I'm going to show you is the actual data, the actual metrics that are assigned, but that has a lot of numbers and it kind of makes your eyes hurt. So to make this easier to discuss, all I have done is sort these in rank order, in descending rank order, so we can talk about their relative position and how these different measurements affect them. So these are their ranks within the discipline. This column shows their relative rank by impact factor. So trends in ecology and evolution is number 1. Then PLOS biology, biological reviews, global change biology, bioscience, and ecology. Okay. We would expect the 5-year impact factor to be pretty similar, because although the number of citations is going to increase between the 2-year window and the 5-year window, generally in similar fields they're going to increase at the same rate, so your relative position doesn't change. And that again is the case here, with one difference. This title has not been around long enough to have a 5-year impact factor. So since that takes out the 4th position, these 2 titles move up in relative ranks. Okay. Then if we look at the eigenfactor, we start to see some differences. The eigenfactor rewards rapid citation and large volume. Okay. So just given that much information, who would we expect to be first? Well, PLOS biology, and sure enough, it is. Ecology is next, global change biology. Trends in ecology and evolution has now dropped to 4th from 1st, and bioscience and biological reviews. So again, we would sort of expect to see the prestige rankings, the ones that are based on prestige, to have similar ranks. Well, what the eigenfactor is doing is sort of intensifying the impact factor. So it's not just the number of citations, but the impact factor of the journal that is citing you. So it's a multiplier effect. And that can create some differences. So apparently there are a lot of titles that cite this journal, but they have lower impact factors. Okay. Then when we look at the SCImago journal rank, this one's a little different. It's having us it's trying to balance across the disciplines more. It is better for new areas and smaller disciplines. So how does that work out? Well, not sure that would apply here, but this one does pretty well. Biological reviews has really jumped up. It's hard to say for sure, but SCImago is looking at a larger universe. So it looks at more titles, and that may account for some of the differences here. Then lastly, we come to the SNP, the Source Normalized Impact per paper, which is the one that's better for the social sciences and also is comparing you to a specific cohort that is dynamic and self-correcting. One of the reasons this is better for social science is that it takes size into consideration. So here's PLOS Biology in the last position. Well, that's because it's taking not just the number of citations per article, like the other measurements are, but it's then further dividing that by the total number of references in the papers that are citing the journal. Okay, so if there is a disciplinary norm in biology that there are 50 citations per article, that's going to be taken into account. So even though there's a higher overall number of citations, it cuts that down. Whereas a discipline, perhaps ecology, only has 20 references per article. So those titles are going to look better. And interestingly, it's all three ecology journals that are in the top half in the SNP, the source normalized impact per paper. Okay. So now you've had a look at these relative positions. This next slide, and you can see why it wasn't the first slide, because you would all leave and not talk to me anymore. This is the data that went into that. These are what the actual metrics look like. The impact factor, you can see, has 3 digits. You can see these high impact factors, one for a large open access journal, another one that does reviews. Pretty much the titles that do well here are either all reviews or do a lot of reviews. And you can see the 5-year impact factor. They all increase, but perhaps at different rates. For the eigenfactor, you're seeing how rapid citation and large volume is again reflected. So this is the biggest one. Here's the next biggest, kind of what we would expect. Remember the eigenfactor, because it is intensifying the impact factor and it's only looking at that smaller group of titles that the impact factor is based on, it tends to correspond pretty well to the impact factor. Okay. Now we have 2 different categories. These are the 2 Elsevier groups. And Scimago is the one that's better for the new areas and the smaller disciplines.
I think that's the Scimago, I think, is more like the eigenfactor.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's another prestige one. So the prestige is calculated in a different way, but this is that larger universe. So these are generally pretty similar. There may be a few differences. But our big surprise here, the big difference, is the SNP. And it's hard to believe that PLOS Biology has gone from being 1 and 2 in every measure, and it's a dead last here. But that's because the SNP is taking into account what the volume of potential references are and adjusting the number of actual references by how many references were possible. Okay, so I realize that's kind of a quick run through. We can come back to this one in the question session if you want to, but we just couldn't talk about metrics and not actually show you what they looked like. Thank you.
Thanks for that overview, October, and the view of the detail. So we come to what the key takeaways are. Just to summarize before Tim has addresses what you can actually do that might make a difference in these measures. And we just like to point out that no metric is perfect. The new ones aren't perfect either. They haven't been around long enough to reveal some of their frailties, but if you look on the web, you will begin to see criticisms of such things as the H factor or some of the other, the eigenfactor in terms of what they can do, but what they can't do. The impact factor is still, because it's prominent. It's been around the longest. It's the best known, but it has its limitations. And the biggest limitation is the fact that it's not a standard metric that means the same thing across all disciplines. It affects, the categories affect both the impact factor and they'll influence the eigenfactor. So these discipline areas have a huge impact in terms of what the actual data look like and in terms of how they're interpreted or potentially the risk of their being misinterpreted. And if you're in a new or emerging area or in an area with interdisciplinary journals, you're more likely to find that the more fluid and organic grouping of cohort titles is advantageous. Impact factor does tend to favor the larger, more rapidly moving content areas. So with that as a summary, I'm very happy to turn this over to Tim Beardsley, who will bring his perspective to what editors can do and authors can do.
Thanks, Judy. I'm glad of this opportunity. Let me preface what I'm going to say by this. I take publication ethics seriously, and I think all editors should do. If they don't, they'll quickly earn the disfavor of potential authors. But there's a lot that editors can do to promote the interests of a journal, including looking at measures of the journal's influence that are very much in line with the author's interests as well, because authors want to publish in high-impact factor journals. We've heard about a lot of these different measures and the differences between them. I can't suggest anything that can be done to influence any one of these measures as an editor at the expense of one of the others. So I can't necessarily suggest anything that I think will increase SNP, but more than impact factor, for example. Nevertheless, there are a number of things that have become apparent to me over the years that are going to help measures that rely on citation in general. First of all, understand the competitive position of your journal. This is really just know yourself, which is always good advice for individuals as well as for journal editors. And know where your authors are coming from and use that knowledge as a source of ideas where to find other reviewers, as well as potential authors, other potential authors, of course. If you've got an academic department that is a thriving hub of research on plant biology, and you're interested in publishing papers on that subject, it's going to be in your interest to make sure you know who are the key players there. Learn also which of your own published articles have been well cited. It's relatively easy to discover that, and gives you a clue to who are the authors that have favored your journal in the past, who might be worth approaching to write again, because productive scientists tend to keep on being productive. But not just understand yourself, get to know where authors also submit manuscripts. It's easy to find this out. Google Scholar is a rough and ready measure. There's a lot been written about its inadequacies, but it is still pretty useful despite the fact that you can criticize it because it is so quick and easy. You can easily find where your star authors are also publishing, and then of course you can make sure you get to know what the tables of contents are of those same journals, so you can keep an eye on what's happening in the fields that you're interested in. Okay, determine the unique contribution of your journal. This is where difficult strategic questions arise, but having understood what you're doing, you've then got to decide if it's consistent with the mission for the journal as defined, as established by the publishing organization, whatever that may be. it might be, it might not be, but if it's not, there are things you can do to change it. And the strongest tool by far that I'm aware of that an editor can use is by inviting articles. If, like Bioscience, you have to impose page charges on authors who submit manuscripts, you can usually waive them, or certainly Bioscience, we do waive them for invited articles. Authors like to be invited to contribute, and if they are invited, they don't expect to be invited to pay. So waiving page charges, making that clear in an invitation, enables you to often persuade influential authors to submit articles. And of course, this enables you to steer the interest in your journal towards topics that seem relevant. Editorial board appointments are important. I like activist editorial board members. Editorial board members who will suggest articles to invite, who will be imaginative about bringing in potential reviewers. Don't just think about the United States of America. It's easy for Americans to get to feel a little insular. America is certainly the most important country in terms of its contributions to science in general still, I think. But a lot of other countries are rapidly catching up on it in terms of importance and influence, and it would be myopic to forget about that. And so do think about areas where concentrations of expertise and excellence in other countries, and I guess it would be up to the editor to try to understand what those are using some of the techniques I've already mentioned. Obviously then getting editorial board members in those countries, in those centers of excellence overseas, is going to help. We've made some use of that. I frequently contact editorial board members just to chat about what's going on in their fields and ask them for ideas. And if there are any that don't seem to have too many ideas, I politely retire them from the editorial board and find somebody who's prepared to be more useful. Editorial policy. Going on to the next slide. Publish niche content and focus on new and emerging ideas. Well, this is perhaps a matter of personal style, and of course it also depends on the mission of the journal as envisaged by the sponsoring organization, and that has to be respected. But I guess I would encourage editors in general to remember always that reviewers provide advice, and that the editor should consider the totality of the situation, of the information about a submission before making a decision. It doesn't have to be governed by the advice of any particular reviewers. And, editors sometimes do go somewhat against the grain of the advice of reviewers because they might see that they have a broader perspective and have a particular reason for wanting to publish an article in a particular area. New and emerging ideas are one example of that. I think many editors would agree that in a new and emerging field, it's acceptable, even desirable, to publish articles that have a more speculative sort of content than in a more established field where the science is working to consolidate rather than to venture into new territory. So sometimes we'll publish a paper that we know is somewhat speculative, as long as the appropriate qualifications are in there. That's a valid consideration, and it can certainly help attract interest to your journal if it indicates that you know what the emerging areas are. Publishing themed issues is something we've often done in Bioscience. It's always been rather successful for us. People do like the idea of having a whole collection of articles, and if it's done right, it also enables you to go into a rather more depth on particular subjects than you can in individual articles. Of course, there's a cost to it. It's usually more work for the editors, and it in principle should delay other articles slightly, but you have to make the trade-offs that seem appropriate. Certainly one or two themed issues per year with prestigious editors is something that can be used to advantage, to your advantage as the journal as well as to authors' advantage. Publishing review articles and invite them. They are valuable in academia, but authors often of this who are primarily researchers often feel they're too busy to write them, but if invited can be persuaded. It's good for the science and it's good for your journal if they publish them. Target topical areas rather than continuing studies. This is a slightly tricky one. You don't want to be seen to be only pursuing the latest thing, and there is value certainly in studies that assess research that's gone on for years, but I think I've already said enough about that. You should make sure you're aware of the latest areas as well. Seek out prolific, top-quality authors and invite. I'm fairly shameless about inviting people to write, and they don't always say yes, but they quite often do, and usually we end up with a good article. And I've already alluded to the international nature of scholarship. Those invitations will often be to people overseas when those are important areas. As far as managing the editorial process is concerned, all authors want to be published quickly. I take that as self-evident. And though if you're reliant on volunteer reviewers, that can be that's easier said than done. We certainly take considerable effort to chase up reviewers, to see how long they're taking. If they're not responding to an email or a reminder email, we'll get on the phone. We'll call them wherever they may be in the world, wherever they can be found, and pester until we get some action out of reviewers in the interests of getting articles that are going to be accepted into print as soon as possible. We're going to start looking at online ahead of print for bioscience, and I recommend other journals to consider that also. In the digital age that we are now in, sometimes the delays associated with print publication can seem frustrating to authors. They still want the authority of a print publication, but putting edited articles, we're going to put edited articles, not accepted articles, online ahead of print is one way to assure authors that you're taking seriously the obligation to try to get their content out there as quickly as possible. And the review abstracts for clarity and articles for readability. This perhaps is something that editors do or think about naturally, but perhaps it bears repeating. A lot of articles that are accepted on the advice of peer reviewers are nevertheless clunky and difficult and awkward to read. And we put a lot of work into editing for readability, for narrative continuity, for consistency. And that can mean, in the case of some articles, that the article is quite radically transformed by a heavy edit. And it's almost always appreciated by authors, I will say that. I have got a file of thank you letters from authors who said, you know, my article will now be better understood and enjoyed by more readers because of the work that your editors have done on it. And editors should realize that that's something they can do to make their articles more attractive. If their articles are more readable, they're going to attract more attention. They're likely to be cited, and so they're going to help your impact your metrics, citation metrics generally. Keep review times short. Well, I've already alluded to that. And yes, if you're taking a very long time to publish, to review and publish articles, you are going to miss a 2-year window for citation of articles that you have published in your own journal. Alert authors to content they might have overlooked. Now, this gets to be a touchy issue. I don't think editors should tell authors to cite particular articles, and I never do that. Sometimes, though, it's apparent reading an article that there has been something published, and it might be in Bioscience because I'm familiar with the content of Bioscience up to and including the last issue. But it might be in another journal that the author is simply not seen because they plainly would have cited it because it's very relevant to the topic if they had seen it, if it's something that I saw in Nature 2 weeks ago. And I will mention it to them and say, look, this seems as if it's relevant. Do you want to consider citing that in your article? And I don't put any pressure on beyond that. If they say no, then no it is. But quite often they'll say, oh, goodness, I wish I'd seen that. Thank you, yes, and they do include it. So sometimes articles, citations of bioscience get published that way. Work with client manager to make key articles freely available. There are limits to this, obviously, unless you're in a open access mode. You can't make everything publicly available permanently, but key articles, often it is worthwhile for the publicity value that they bring to make them publicly available. And what we're doing in bioscience, it seems to be appreciated, is from JSTOR, which the repository, we can get temporary access URLs, which enable us to promote an article on its first publication in electronic newsletters and so forth, and attach a code which will enable people to access and read the article. And these keys, we use keys that are good for 6 weeks. So by the time the next issue comes out, the access key will soon after that start working. But there's always some articles in the latest issue that a lot of people can read, whether they're a subscriber or not. And again, this seems like a good way of promoting interest in articles. We also put out press releases, drawing attention to particular articles, and we make sure that those are ones that are available publicly, at least temporarily. Okay, moving on to what authors can do. Now, this webinar is geared primarily to editors, but as I said, I don't think there's a lot of conflict between authors and editors in this because their interests coincide to a very large degree. Suggesting to authors that they cite their work in articles and editorials placed in other publications and in your own journal is not a bad thing to do, although we've already heard about the dangers of excessive self-citation. I forget if it was Judy or October alluded to the story of the World Journal of Gastroenterology, which was excluded by Thomson because they were excessively citing themselves. That is not anything that's going to happen at Bioscience. As I said, we only occasionally gently suggest citing something that's been published in Bioscience, but sometimes that's appropriate. Review articles and making sure that they have healthy citation lists is obviously going to mean that indices of citation are favorable. Bioscience is mostly review material, as a matter of fact, but many authors just don't get around to writing reviews unless they're invited to. And I'm told that the articles are very helpful in the field, although we don't publish a lot of primary research. The articles are nevertheless extensively cited because of their help in clarifying thinking in a field. Publicize articles within your communities. It seems like a natural thing to say, but to some academic authors, it just doesn't come naturally at all to self-publicize. But gentle reminders, suggestions can persuade them to do more. A lot of manuscripts have to be put in institutional repositories, and that can be required by institutions, it can be required by funding sources. But if that's going to be done, then it's always proper to include a link to the published version of the article in your journal, which will generally be superior because of the editing and quality control that's undergone. And again, worth reminding authors to do that. Many authors, I won't say almost all, but many authors these days are going to have their own web page. You would expect that to be a common thing, and it's an obvious suggestion, and it's certainly within their control to put links and citations of their articles in your journal on the author's own website. And again, I've had authors say, well, I never thought of that. Well, it's a good idea. It's going to help you. It's going to help us. Why don't you do it? And they do. So those are some tips, things that we've had some success with that have seemed to go down well, that I think are consonant with high standards of publication ethics, and I hope that editors will find them useful. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much, and thank you for your other contributions and feedback on this presentation. We're now moving on to what publishers can do, and publishing on time and without delays is actually a core criteria of either Scopus or the Web of Science for accepting a journal if you're not currently in one of these indexes into the index. It really skews the metrics from year to year if the publication is not on time. It also raises questions about the adequate flow of papers and manuscripts. It's important that we're all sensitive to the timeliness of publication, and in some fields, certainly being able to have articles online before they appear in print is very beneficial, but the more time-sensitive the topic, the more important that is. There are opportunities, and working with the University of California Press by way of support to accomplish some of this, to make calls for submission more broadly distributed. And the University of California Press encourages this and is happy to provide support for it. JSTOR ads can be placed for a call for papers. It's possible to use social media if the editors are so inclined or wish the press to. And creating press releases and can also be used for a call for papers, for particularly if there's a new title or a special issue with a special editor. The creation of press releases is also useful when you're promoting key articles. Every now and then, in the effort to bridge theory to practice or to a more broader popular audience, the publications that are not considered scholarly but have an interest in the results of the scholarly research are particularly interested in some new developments, and putting out a press release about those can be very useful, and you can even highlight potentially a free article. So this wraps up our ideas for you, and now we're going to turn it over to you and in an effort to hear your ideas and questions.
Hi, Judy. We've had a couple of questions come in. The first one is, what value metrics should a journal focus on the most, and how would an editor determine which metric is the most appropriate for their journal?
Judy, is it okay if I take this one?
Please do, October.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my advice would be to try and look at all of them, all of the metrics we've covered today. And you can work with your manager at the press to compile these lists. And I would do it not just for your own title. You don't want to look at it in isolation, but in your cohort group. What other titles do you want to compare yourself to? And I think once you've done that, some of these differences we were trying to describe to you will become apparent. You'll be able to see which one or two metrics are actually the most useful to you in representing the scope and focus and the kinds of things you're trying to do with your journal. You may wish to continue to monitor them all because you may get questions. For instance, if you decide impact factor doesn't really work for you, but you may still want to monitor it. And then if you get questions about the impact factor, you can respond with the information you have about some of these alternative measurements.
So we have a question from Joan Stieber from Jerry, and she says, it sounds like the SNP metric would be relevant to her journal, which is the Journal of Human Research, Empirical Research in Human Research Ethics. Sorry, Joan. And she wanted to know how she could find Jerry's SNP score.
Joan, that is available actually for free on the web. Thomson has a fee-based gateway, and Rachel's been helpful in obtaining that data for us. But your advantage with SNP is that it's available, and we are posting a link or distributing a link in a 2-page reference list that will be distributed following this conference call, so that you can simply click through to it and find it and find the other journals in the cohort in which your journal appears.
Right, and this is October. One more thing I would do, and which we cut out for length, is many of these metrics go back, 10 years, more than 10 years. So if you want to pick a benchmark, say you became the editor in 2003 or something, you might go back to 2002, look at the metrics for that period, then look, every couple of years you could actually put together a timeline of showing how, what the metrics were doing. I think that historical perspective would give you a lot better understanding of what the current numbers you're seeing mean.
And then there's a follow-up question from Joan about how would you recommend how do you recommend how she publicizes her metrics?
That's a number of ways to do that. Many publishers will make sure it goes on any of the web pages that appear for their particular journal. It can change from year to year, but it can be promoted that way. Press releases are sometimes appropriate. And it might be good to communicate with the societies where the potential authors reside, looking at the affiliations of the current authors in your publication and the organizations that they belong to in terms of promoting the journal itself, as well as whenever you do promote the journal, including the metrics with it, potentially with even a byline about what they mean or why that's important.
And so just one last question. How are the categories determined, and is there any way that a journal can influence in which category it appears?
Well, the categories for the newer metrics being self-forming would be a little more challenging to influence. I would think that could be done potentially by working with other authors and looking at your abstract. But for your own, for the Thomson's Web of Knowledge, they are receptive. They make changes to their categories all the time, and although they're predetermined, they are receptive to receiving communications, which they do frequently, from editors indicating that they feel their journal belongs in yet a second category or third one, or that they are potentially misclassified in the category in which they're in. So they may not always agree with the person submitting the request for review, but many times they do, and it's possible to accomplish changes that way.
That's great. Thank you very much. So this is the end of our discussion. I'm sure there's a contact list. If you wanted to get hold of your client manager, please contact Spencer or Devon. And I wanted to thank Judy, October, and Tim for their participation today. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.